Talking Violence. With Brad Evans. Discussing the difficult questions concerning the human condition. What does it mean to utter the words civil war today? How can the concept allow us to make sense of the dangerous political times in which we live? And how can we do justice to its very naming, which both civil and violent also suggests something truly perilous in its very announcement? I first encountered the work of David Theo Goldberg some 15 years ago. Ever insightful and considered, I have come to learn so much from his interventions, including how to think more seriously about the legacies of racism and to consider what he continues to call the racial state. What's always struck me as important about David's work is the way he continues to address race, not as a problem that is somehow sealed in some neatly contained colonial imaginary. The contours of race, as David shows, have been reshaped by wider social factors, notably neoliberalism. Such change in racial fortunes and violences are now furthered here as David considers the very meaning of civil war in a time of global lockdown. Central to his thesis is the way racial violence has been recast through a changing global cartography of power, not least through the changing nature in the power of technology. Not only does this raise pressing and urgent questions on the relationship between planetary crises and their ability to recast local effects, it also demands a more astute reading of history as racial violence morphs out of religious wars and are now being reset through the great digital divides. David Theo Goldberg is the director of the University of California Humanities Research Institute, and he continues to write extensively on the question of race and the so-called post-racial moment in political affairs. It is therefore with great pleasure that I am able to introduce David's talk on Civil War Year, which offers a compelling mediation that is part of a wider book project currently in production.
Politics today is nothing short of civil war. The driving question is no longer so much whether this conflict or that is a civil war. David Armitage, for example, argues along those lines. So it's no longer that, but what work the notion of civil war is being politically exercised to do. States descend into civil wars when contrasting conceptions of life within them are deemed irreconcilable. Living for a considerable proportion of the state's inhabitants is made unbearable. Those at least nominally controlling the state apparatus insist on obedience and deference to its way of being, on pain of erasure for refusal or resistance. Civil wars are struggles over competing ways of being in the world, over their underlying conceptions, over control of the state and its apparatuses to materialize and advance these commitments. Civil wars are not foremost about resorting to arms, even as they may quickly gear up to blows. For the struggle to be considered blow-worthy, the contrast must be palpable and pressing. The commitments animating civil war constituting the political today are forced appeals to contrasting sets of commitments. These competing conceptions are conflicts in the making, enlarged between commitments to closed and open worlds, to homogeneous and heterogeneous social ecologies, to purity and mestizaje, to spiraling inequalities or regulated fairness, to securitizing and convivial states. The tensions manifest in other dimensions of the social and political too, in assertions of authority over accountability, command over constitutionality, fabrication or make-believe over appeals to evidence. They include recourse to contempt and violence rather than appeals to respect, dignity, interactive engagement and responsibility, and assertions of solipsistic, self-promoting power and petty authoritarianisms over cohabitation. The insistence, in short, is to a securitizing state over a relatively caretaking one, to the slow violence of barely perceptible conflicts over the infrastructures of caretaking. Civil wars, accordingly, are social saturations, warring without war, conflictual engagements without full realization. There are obviously more nuanced, lived and negotiated between and multifold states than these broad contrasts. But the broader and more fixed the contrast, the more uncompromising the commitment to a single side, the more readily one can characterize this as civil social warring. Civil war, accordingly, offers an analytic for the contemporary social condition. Civil war's force is one-sided. It forces one side's commitments onto those uninterested in, even indifferent to, disagreeing with, and especially resisting them. But one-sided even more pressingly in that the force is almost invariably the product of fixating on a homogenizing commitment, on authority, the compulsion in make-believe, command, contempt, and fixity, and on their conditions of reproduction. The struggle comes down to that between manipulated control at any and all cost and to co-constitutive interactive engagement. Civil struggles that blow up into full-fledged wars, whether conceptually or materially, culturally or politico-economically, require people to declare their commitments, to take sides as the economy is reconfigured, social relations are reordered, inequalities spiral. This is demanded of both members of the society and distant observers. Neutrality in the face of impending death and destruction, in the final analysis, is itself side-taking. Racialities mark all the warring contrasts. They help both to shape and to sharpen them. Race reflects and animates, at least partly constitutes and exacerbates these conditions. Race is a prompt and product of social warring, its medium and outcome. It represents violence in the waiting, in the making, offense and defense, embodied and enacted. A civil war, then, immediately draws a sharp line, the line, you could say, in the sand. On one side are those claiming to assume the side of the state as status quo, of law and order, no matter how unjust. On the other are those for whom the powers and social arrangements the state represents fall critically short, and in defense of which the state resorts to repressive violence. Those outside the territorial line, the globally segregated, marked for and by preclusion, are those likely characterized as unbelonging and, of course, undeserving. They will be cast out as outsiders within. They are tarred with the brush of racial difference. John Coetzee, one of the volumes of his memoirish trilogy, suggests that the modern state is white and Christian by design, descent, and legacy. Even secularized states embed their history, the defining features, traditions, commitments, the ways of being and seeing assumed from Christian whiteness. Reinventions of religiosities, first elaborations, then remainders of race. Race, in short, is a secularization of the religious. Religious wars historically marking the European landscape today are nothing short of race wars, internalized, about self-proclaimed origin narratives, about make-believe kinship, not so long ago explicitly called blood, about the landscape and its ownership, about access and privilege, control over resources and decision-making, truth claims, facts and evidence, about cultural legacy and its parental provenance, which is to say about its heritage, but also about its so-called proper inheritance, its rightful heirs in whose name the culture will supposedly live on as defining traces, even while being remade. At their core, race wars concern the right to be, To belong, the interacting epistemological and ontological powers of self-determination. The line keeping outsiders out works in terms of the racial determination of immigration and the technologies of bordering. For Europe, these racial determinations reach across historical and contemporary lines. Jews, Muslims, Arabs, Blacks, Roma, Asians, and South Asians. In the US today, Blacks, Latinos, Muslims, immigrants generally, and Jews. The line marking insiders as not fully belonging is inscribed in terms of differentiations in blood, bones, and behavior, culture and character, projected in capacity and lack of intelligence. The preclusions are enacted in the name of maintaining historical homogeneity in the face of its undoing. But the maintenance, first of the fantasy of differentiated being and capacity, and then of its enactment, is possible only by the compulsions of make-believe. This conservation requires force and forced constraint of thought and deed, of compelled movement and sedentarism. Temporary encampments perhaps collapse the two. This forced preservation has always necessitated technological enablement. The border, once a line in the sand made cartographic, then required barbed wire. Today it resurrects the border wall. The political wall invariably requires more than cement to maintain its political aims. It always requires, in reiterative and ever-enlarging ways, supplementation. More wall, higher, longer, wider, deeper. Surveillance and policing, human and technological. Oversight and sub-censored. A more cemented politics, you could say. Political wars are extended, irresolute technologies of civil warring, not their resolution. They are in fact a land grab, a form of imperial state imposition. They colonize not just the land on which they are erected, nor only the land on either side or at either end. They are in fact colonizations of the landscape. They order the contours of the visible, of the lived, of ontic community, and the denials marking its constituting being and way of life. Fortress Europe, walled America, moded Australia. Political wars are racial by conception, design, and implementation. In being about the lives of others, they are inevitably about ourselves too, whatever we mean by each. The homogeneity effected with political warring is purchased at the cost of lives interrupted and disrupted. These drives to the homogenizing are both prompted and reinforced by the recent shifts in political economy to what I conceive of as tracking capitalism. That's tracking capitalism hyphenated. Tracking capitalism in this sense is a capitalism that tracks, not a tracking of capitalism, but a capitalism that itself tracks. It tracks people in spiraling volume and range, activity, movement, and networking interaction. COVID-19 is prompting the shift from tracing viral flows to normalizing the tracking of everyone's vital measurements, heart rate, body temperature, location, and engagements with others, once self-chosen, you might say, now state-imposed. Tracking has moved from the commercial venture to the reach for biopolitical control, as we are repeatedly reminded that the eco-forming we fashion between the biocentric and human-centric spins from time to time out of control. Microbes penetrate unguarded gaps as these eco-formations settle structurally in place, taking up residence where least expected because they are least visible and so available to control. Techno-tracking, already embedded in the process of economic development and deployment, ramps up as bioeconomic response because the technology is available, has traction, advances profitability, and secures eco-political regulation and order. Surveillance is a generic term adopted for attending closely to a person, monitoring their movements and thoughts. Technologically enhanced surveillance is about a century old. Wiretapping, for instance, took hold in the 1930s, targeting suspected criminals and labour and political activists. More recently, tracking has provided the precise technologies needed to enable this micro-monitoring. The entanglement of data, managed if not manipulated consumption, embroidered if not crafted political commitments and choices, brings together immense economic and political power. The rapid advancement of AI and machine learning technologies has centered tracking technologies in the contemporary political economy. At the outset of digital proliferation, users turned to search engines like Google, using them as means to discovery. With a ramped-up transition to the pervasiveness of tracking capitalism, Google and other search engines increasingly became the tracker, users the tracked. Search results became the means. The resultant profiles have since advanced the enormous profitability generated from individual consumptive practices and the accompanying technologies of social control. Yuval Noah Harari concedes that a regime able to mandate, store and analyze the genetic data of all its citizens will be better positioned to address medical challenges efficiently, or for that matter, the health impacts of global warming. In 2017, a new medication came to market that included a, quote, digital ingestion tracking system, enabling medical practitioners to determine if and when a patient properly imbibed their medicine. But as Harari quickly recognizes, these sorts of developments will likewise position the current medical regime to dominate in an increasingly unchallengeable way. The state will more likely be able to mandate who under its jurisdiction flourishes and languishes, cementing its unbridled power over life and death. We are already witnessing a calculation of coronavirus survivability, and by extension livability, from Italy to Texas, for example. Harari calls this digital dictatorship. The digital can wax dictatorial in two related ways. Digital profiling could soon inform dictation of life-forming decisions, not just what to study and profession to pursue or whom to marry, but who gets to live in a pandemic and who doesn't. It can also provide the awesome technological apparatuses for rulers to tighten authoritarian domination and control. Tracking capitalism thus enables tracing global movements of human capital, just-in-time delivery of labour and product, threats and disruptions. Tracking drives micro-targeting of genes and proteins that have a causative role in the disease, of people with the disease and those with whom they interact, of this condition and when, if at all, to intervene with treatment. Foucault famously distinguished between expulsion as a political technology governing response to leprosy and containment as that responding to the plague. Tracking capitalism fine-tunes an insidious dynamic, keeping those who belong locked down while determining who should be locked out. It is fine-tuning in real time the governmentality of securitization as the emerging logics of domination programming our times. Racial consideration, indeed determination, accordingly is at work here definitively. Race provides the brush painting the line between belonging and unbelonging. Racial characterization, or more forcefully, determination, color codes the constitutively belonging from those made not to belong. It baptizes the, you could call it, legitimately born within from the coming from without, the pure from the polluting, the nominally trusted from projected threat. For racial states, enemies, like poverty, are always racially defined. Recent expressions of this racial politics of civil warring proliferate. The insistence across the continent of Europe for Europeans, that Britain is full up, on America as the land of white power, the increasing need to assert it volubly indicative of its fragility in each case. The emergence in France and Italy of Génération Identitaire, insisting on Muslim-free and Catholic, Caucasian committed countries, similarly evidences the cracks in the homogenizing cement. There is a demonstrable correlation between those fearing demographic and cultural heterogeneity and votes for a politics of and politicians representing repression. This fear is of what diversity stands for, represents, or imaginarily entails as lived condition, as social future. Hardly natural, the fear is drummed up, helped along, shaped and exacerbated by the techno forces of globalization. Russian bots, British analytics firms, American hedge fund managers, and fear-generating politicians everywhere. This racial fear-mongering has been quite common in the post-colonial era. Think the range from Enoch Power, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Marine Le Pen, Viktor Orban, Andrzej Duda, Donald Trump. ... Post-raciality is not the end of race, let alone racism. The force of the post-racial today lies not in the claim to be beyond race, even in the aspirational sense. Rather, it is the subterfuge of afterthought in the nave of which the most violent and vile forms of racism are being recharged. The post-racial is but the contemporary modality of racism's renewal and virality. License is given for those self-entitled to express themselves publicly in blatantly racist ways with far less consequence than in the immediately post-civil rights era. These expressions can take the form of words and deeds, sometimes with physical and invariably with expressive violence. They obviously debilitate those at whom these expressions of violence are aimed, usually those in more vulnerable positions than the perpetrators. But in doing so, they debilitate and delimit the society at large. Racial fabrication never quite fit the facts on the ground. Heterogeneities are messy, uncontainable. It's what makes them so attractive and open to attack by those threatened by their promiscuity. The imperative of a politics of homogenization is fueled out of fear of the proverbial black-brown planet. It is the defense of what you might call, and what Houston Baker, for example, used to call white world, its privileges and powers against the invading barbarians out supposedly to decivilize society. In announcing the bombing of the Syrian Air Force base in April 2017, in the wake of the chemical attack by Assad, Trump did so explicitly in the name of calling on all civilized nations, his words, of the world. Marine Le Pen characterized her French presidential run against Macron in 2017 as the choice about civilization. Again, her words. Civil wars are conflicts over the contours, colouring, quality and character of civil and social life, and over the levers of state as their materialization. They are wars over the very fabric of being in the social world, over the conditions of state control and what counts as civility. Civility is the inheritance of normativized ways of social being and doing, sedimenting into set modes considered, given, natural, common sense. These ways, the inheritance of modernizing state-making, are racially ordered all the way up and down. Violations or transgressions are taken as attacks on ways of life, on the life world itself. These life worlds are racially constituted and comprehended. The breached wall is to be cemented with the mud of reinvented racialities against invasion and claim pollution of the invented tradition. Make whatever great again. Post-raciality's homogenizing parochialism ranges over various contemporary instances, all exhibiting their own, if related, versions of race-making. Racial invention, as narrative of kinship, lineage, common biology, entails that the claim to seek out and live with those like you is partial to the fabrication too. What follows is invariably the self-license, the entitlement, to say and almost do anything about and to the projected non-belonging, no matter how offensive and violent. Philomena Essed recently has been calling this entitlement racism. It underwrites the license to authoritarianism, large and petty. The retreat into walling off solipsism and curtailment of curiosity can only materialize as violence generalized across the social condition writ large. The violence is as much hermeneutical as material. Homogenization as process in politics is possible in birth and beyond only with the force, the violence of repression. Alongside the insistent imposition of technologies of identification, identity optimality is a racial governance project. Identities become civil war prompts and extensions. The dominant responses to the justice pursuing insistence that, say, Black or Palestinian lives matter has been the restricting pronouncement that all lives matter, blue lives matter, or Israel's self-defense matters. The latter are parochial identitarianisms parading as universalisms. Such responses heighten the danger of devolving into finger-pointing, moralizing, extending violence against the perennially targeted. Equality requires, relationally, that all lives won't matter until Black and Palestinian lives, all Black and Palestinian lives, lives recognized in and for their Blackness and Palestinianity, really do. For blue lives and Israeli security to matter, Black and Palestinian lives must equally and be recognized as such, not least by blue lives and Israelis, and more generally by all. Where optimality is not a racial operation, but dignified lives without wars or whimsical frisks, tear gas, tasers and bullets. Where the thoughtless devolution into civil war is not just a strategic option. It is unthinkable, inconceivable, no option at all. Only when the all no longer artificially reduces its universalism to the chosen of one national deity or another by walling itself within the borders of this or that ethno-racially presupposed, self-segregating turf or territory, neighborhood or nation, will weaponizing give way to nonviolence, militarization to demilitarizing the social, humiliation to humility and dignity. The intensities and suspicions of perpetual civil war only then will make way for open civility, dignified sociality, interactive co-constitution, and politico-economic equality. This in turn points to the necessity and grounds of working coalitions to undercut the possibility of civil wars. The most effective large-scale anti-racist movements, abolition, civil rights, anti-apartheid, now BLM, have been cross-racial, multi-gendered, multi-generational, cross-class, local and global. They are interactive. The leadership has been mixed, ever mindful of the concerns of constituencies represented by other than their own. The politics of purification, of ethno-racial self-elevation and encirclement is a politics of closure, of exclusion, of elimination. It is the waging of a purging civil war. By contrast, coalitional politics in the interests of promoting a constantly renewing commons are open, inviting, exciting, multiplicitous, heterogeneous, not shutting down by shutting up or shutting out. This in turn necessitates translation into concrete developments, visible transformations of the commonplace to the greater equality and betterment of all.
you.